The catacombs, deep below the Paris Opera House. A lake 5 stories below the opera stage, above which tower lofty arches. Dampness and decay hold sway. Hidden deep within this macabre sepulchre of shadows is the lair of the opera ghost, a tall, skeletal, mad, corpse-like, disfigured genius with a death's head for a face. A creature of the imagination, a spectral shade, or the phantom of the opera. The Paris Opera, built between 1861 and 1875, occupied 3 full acres and stood 17 stories, 7 of them subterranean. Soon after construction began, an underground stream was discovered. When it flooded the site, a concrete foundation was built, which resulted in the formation of a lake. The opera stage above was shifted and positioned directly over this lake. It was here that Charles Gounod's 1859 opera Faust played the newly opened Paris Opera in 1875. The opera, like the opera house itself, would become the centerpiece of the 1910 novel La Fantôme de l'Opéra, written by journalist-turned-novelist Gaston Leroux, one of the most successful turn-of-the-century French mystery writers. In 1909, Leroux, an admirer of Charles Garnier, the architect who designed the opera house, was allowed to explore its depths, parts of which hadn't been inspected for a generation. Descending into its bowels, some 70 feet below the ground, he was astonished by the maze of labyrinths. So much did they resemble the designs of a madman. The secret rooms, torture chambers, and eerie atmosphere provided an immediate inspiration. A villainous ghoul who dwells in the underworld and haunts the Paris Opera. He remembered, too, an 1896 accident in which one of the great chandelier's counterweights had plummeted into the audience. Could not the phantom have been responsible for this devilry? Leroux consulted medical reference works to determine the effects on a human being when deprived of sunlight, clean water, and sanitary conditions for a number of years. Leprosy was an obvious outcome. He studied the case of Joseph Merrick, known as the Elephant Man. From these, Leroux fashioned Eric the Phantom, from whose madness sprang tormented genius. Loss of muscle tissue had left him emaciated and skeletal. Jaundice turned his skin sickly yellow. Lack of sunlight led to the loss of ears, nose, lips, eyelids, hair. His teeth rotted and turned brown. Motifs borrowed from both Faust and La Belle et la Bête, Beauty and the Beast, made the phantom corrupted by evil and tempted by the love of a pure woman. Could she ignore his hideous appearance and come to love his inner beauty? Le Fantôme de l'Opéra was published in 1910 and appeared in English translation the following year. 2 years later, in 1913, 30-year-old Leonidas Cheney entered the motion picture industry as a contract employee for Universal Studios, founded the previous year as the Universal Film Manufacturing Company. A character actor who specialized in grotesques, he quickly became famous for creating his own makeup and for enduring self-inflicted torture and pain in order to create the disfigured characters he portrayed. He achieved stardom in The Miracle Man of 1919, The Penalty in 1920, in which he portrayed a legless gangster, Shadows in 1922, The Shock in 1923, and especially The Hunchback of Notre Dame, also in 1923, which solidified his position as a major box office attraction. With the exception of F.W. Murnau's chilling 1922 German classic Nosferatu, few true horror films have been made, especially in Hollywood. After Chaney came to the attention of Irving Thalberg, Carl Laemmle, Director General at Universal, Thalberg acquired the rights to the Phantom of the Opera as a vehicle for the star. Only one actor he knew could portray Eric the Phantom. That actor was Lon Chaney, by now known worldwide as the Man of 1,000 Faces. Director Rupert Julian, set to direct the film, insisted, "Lon Chaney or it can't be done." Chaney, however, was no longer employed by the studio. During the making of The Hunchback, Thalberg had left to become Louis B. Mayer's production manager at Metro Pictures, soon to become Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Soon thereafter, Lon Chaney joined Metro as well. Universal quickly obtained the use of Chaney's services. The contract, a one-picture agreement that, oddly enough, was not initially negotiated with the Phantom in mind, contained an unprecedented clause. Chaney would not be obligated to give the producer approval of his makeup, and no photographs of his makeup could be exploited until after the release of the film. He was to have starred in an adaptation of Victor Hugo's The Man Who Laughs, which Universal subsequently made in 1928 with German actor Conrad Veidt. Chaney chose, however, the Gothic chiller that Thalberg had bought for him in 1922, The Phantom of the Opera. Mary Filburn, Norman Kerry, and Arthur Edmund Carew were cast as his co-stars. The schedule would be tight, but the star was already scheduled to make He Who Gets Slapped and The Unholy Three for MGM. After 5 successive script treatments, one of the most famous silent films ever made, containing one of the most terrifying scenes in cinema history, The Unmasking of the Phantom, went into production. The fabulous Paris Opera House was rebuilt on the backlot in Universal City. Already the location of Erich von Stroheim's colossal Monte Carlo set for Foolish Wives, and the immense Cathedral of Notre Dame for The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Art director and set designer Ben Carré, a Frenchman who had once worked at the opera, obtained a copy of the original blueprints. He and his team of 11 sculptors and scenic artists faithfully recreated the Paris Opera down to the last detail. In doing so, Kevin Brownlow has observed, he set a style that would become the trademark of the Universal horror films of the 30s, Hollywood Gothic. As no stage on the backlot was large enough to accommodate the vast interior of the opera, Universal erected one, which still stands today on stage 28. Complicating the problems of the art department was Carl Laemmle's announcement that the masked ball sequence would be shot in 2-strip Technicolor, a process that had already been used throughout The Toll of the Sea, a 1922 feature starring Anna May Wong. Shooting began on 29 October 1924. The production was troubled from start to finish. Chaney had wanted Wallace Wolseley, who had directed The Hunchback of Notre Dame, as his director, but Rupert Julian, who was fond of emulating Erich von Stroheim's autocratic demeanor but lacked von Stroheim's talent, got the job. Chaney and Julian disliked each other immediately. Direct communication broke down, and Julian was forced to have an assistant convey his instructions to the star. In a 1974 reminiscence, cinematographer Charles Van Enger recalled that, more often than not, Chaney would reply, "Tell him to go and screw himself. I will do it the way I want to do it." Chaney wound up directing most of his own scenes. Principal shooting was completed by the end of December. 2 endings had been shot, in one of which the lovesick Phantom dies of a broken heart. A rough cut of 22 reels was assembled and previewed in Los Angeles on the 7th of January 1925, and another was held on the 26th. When audiences objected to the unrelenting horror, Carl Laemmler had shelved the picture and cancelled the New York premiere. Principal members of the cast were called back to shoot hastily scripted retakes and comedy relief scenes under the direction of comedy specialist Edward Sedgwick, and the film was cut to 12 reels. The original ending was replaced by a mob scene, a frenetic carriage ride, and a chase past the old Cathedral of Notre Dame set from The Hunchback. Once relatively moderately budgeted, the Phantom had now cost nearly $1 million. Still, another premiere was held in San Francisco on the 26th of April 1925, but it too was withdrawn for further editing. After gifted director Lewis Weber made the final cut, Carl Laemmler launched a colossal publicity and merchandising campaign, said to have been the most ambitious in cinema history. Thurston, the celebrated magician, was engaged to make a ghost appear at the New York premiere. Grosset and Dunlap issued a photoplay edition of the novel. Stores nationwide sold Phantom Red lipstick and cosmetics, Phantom candy and Phantom radios. The Phantom of the Opera was finally premiered in New York on the 6th of September 1925 and in Hollywood on the 17th of October. It was the picture sensation of the year, grossing nearly $2 million. Lon Chaney's makeup created a sensation. He used chemicals to dilate the pupils of his eyes, cotton wadding and celluloid discs to emphasize his cheekbones, and small prongs attached to fang-like teeth to give his mouth a sickening, sardonic grin. When lit from beneath, his face looked literally like a skull. After The Phantom of the Opera was released in France in 1925, Gaston Leroux began writing a sequel, The Return of the Phantom. He died in 1927, and Universal bought the rights from his widow in 1929. Talking pictures had by now arrived in Hollywood. At the height of this all-talking, all-singing, all-dancing craze, Carl Laemmler announced that a sequel would be filmed, starring Conrad Veidt and directed by German director Paul Lenny, whose The Cat and the Canary and The Man Who Laughs starring Veidt had been recent hits for Universal. Laemmler was also keen to make Dracula, provided they could obtain Lon Chaney, who had been voted in 1928 the #1 male box office attraction of the world. They couldn't. Chaney, under contract to MGM, was already ill with the throat cancer that would kill him in 1930. Laemmler decided to reissue The Phantom of the Opera after adding dialogue scenes, more Technicolor sequences, chiefly from the Faust opera, and dubbed voices. New footage of Mary Philbin and Norman Kerry was shot, as were new titles. Chaney's scenes remained silent, as his contract forbade his voice being dubbed. Posters for this 1929 sound version, which opened on the 15th of December, boasted talking, singing, dancing. A new silent version was released as well, to accommodate theaters not yet wired for sound. Because a new all-singing Carlotta was seen and heard in the opera sequences, the Carlotta of the original production was now identified as Carlotta's mother. Despite these alterations, the continuity of this version is similar to that of the 1925 release. Commercial releases of The Phantom of the Opera are silent versions of the 1929 dubbed reissue, although somewhat shorter than the original 1925 release. A near-pristine but incomplete 35mm print of the original 1925 film does exist, but the only complete 1925 release that has been issued commercially was mastered from a 16mm print that is of inferior pictorial quality. One is grateful that the film has survived in any form, for it very nearly perished. Chaney's Phantom made the 1930s Universal horror film cycle possible. For its success, assured Universal the financial resources it needed to produce Dracula. But it all began with Lon Chaney and The Phantom of the Opera in this masterpiece. R. Dixon Smith is the author of Ronald Colman, Gentleman of the Cinema, a biography and filmography in 1991. Lost in the Brentharpian Hills, spanning the decades with Carl Jacobi, 1985. Jeremy Brett and David Burke, An Adventure in Canonical Fidelity, 1986. And with Michael Cox, Remembering Jeremy Brett, 1997. His essay, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and the Lost World, accompanies Eureka Video's DVD release of The Lost World, and he wrote the documentary Happiness Must Be Earned. Douglas Fairbanks and the Thief of Baghdad, which accompanies Eureka Video's DVD release of The Thief of Baghdad. He runs Rupert Books, since 1984 the UK's leading specialists in and publishers of Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes and Jack the Ripper.